As all of you know, the 66th session of the United Nations General Assembly is set to open later today. Ahead of the session, the Middle East issues have gotten quite a bit of attention, but it's really been dominated primarily by discussion of the potential resolution recognizing Palestinian statehood. Not to downplay the importance of that resolution or developments that may come from that. We also think that it's important to look at a lot of other issues in the Middle East, particularly in light of all of the historic changes that have happened with the Arab Spring, the Arab Uprisings that have taken place this year, and what that means for the region and what it may mean for the role of various UN institutions and agencies in the region moving forward. In several respects, UN agencies, UN institutions have maybe played more of a role this year than may have been expected. The UN Human Rights Council, in particular, sort of long maligned and sort of lacking credibility, and often criticized as having included many of the world's worst human rights abusers, has I think played a relatively helpful role in several respects this year. There was a successful effort to prevent Syrian efforts to join the Human Rights Council in the wake of the crackdown there. Libya's membership in the council was suspended in March, and the council has recently had a special session on Syria, which led to the announcement just yesterday of formation of a three-person commission that will be investigating human rights abuses since March in Syria. In addition to these, of course, there were a pair of important Security Council resolutions that sort of paved the way for NATO intervention in Libya. Other institutions, such as the UNDP and the UN Democracy Fund, are both playing a role in trying to support transitions in Egypt and Tunisia. As the General Assembly opens today, if we think about the General Assembly meetings in the last couple of years, they were marked in part by the appearance of many Arab autocrats. Muammar Gaddafi attracted quite a bit of attention in trying to set up his tent in New Jersey or in New York. He then went on to give sort of 90-minute outlandish ranting speech in which he threw accusations at many member states. This year, of course, Gaddafi will not be present. Neither will Ben Ali, nor Assad, nor Mubarak, nor Saleh. And as we look at kind of the General Assembly in kind of in the context of this new Middle East, I think it's important to kind of look at what the changes this year mean for the region and what it may mean for opportunities for UN agencies to play a constructive role moving forward. We have a great panel here today to address these kind of questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heather Hurlburt of National Security Network to make introductions and moderate the discussion.
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you all for coming out this morning. This is a really complex subject, but I say with great pride that I think we've recruited a panel that's more than up to the task, and that the experience and expertise you see represented up here really covers just about every facet of this fascinating challenge. And we'll hear first from Dr. James Zogby, who for 3 decades has been immersed in really every facet of U.S.-Arab relations and Arab-American issues here at home. He's the author most recently of Arab Voices and the founder and president of the Arab-American Institute, but that hardly starts to scratch the surface of the work he's done on behalf of Arab Americans and, frankly, of building up and improving ties between the United States and Arab countries and Arab citizens. He'll be talking this morning about some new public opinion work he's done looking at Arab public opinion toward both the United States and also toward Iran, which will really help us think about the voices that won't be physically at the UN, but that are on the ground really shaping in a way that we've never seen in our lifetimes, shaping the events that we're all responding to. Second, we'll hear from Geneive Abdo, who's a fellow at the Century Foundation and the National Security Network. And Geneive has a long background, first as a foreign correspondent, among other publications for The Guardian and The Economist. She was the first American journalist to be stationed in Tehran after the fall of the Shah, and she's traveled widely in the region, including recently a fascinating trip to Bahrain. But she focuses her work now on Iran through her Inside Iran project, and we'll be talking this morning about the role that Iran is playing in the region and the, frankly, disputed role that Iran now has, and how that is playing out both behind the scenes and very publicly, with Ahmadinejad sort of the last of the dinosaurs who use New York as a platform for, as Stephen was saying, extravagant and fiery speech making. And lastly, we'll hear from Ted Piccone, who will give us the institutional perspective, both in terms of the UN and how these developments will play out at the UN, what role we can look to the UN to play. But I'm also hoping that Ted, who has a long and an illustrious history at the State Department, the National Security Council, and a number of nonprofits, including currently Brookings, will look at how the Arab Spring does or doesn't fit in the sort of history of democratization movements. And I'm hoping for a dose of optimism from Ted, frankly, and the longer term view about where all this is heading and how we can see what happens in the next couple of weeks, what dominates the headlines and what doesn't, as part of a much longer term positive trend. So with that, Jim, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I am not going to walk through numbers and show you a bunch of charts. For those of you who are watching, the poll reports are available on our website at aaiusa.org. You may have picked up a copy out there. So I'll just sort of go through the top line findings and then discuss with you a little bit about what they mean. We did the poll, the last poll we did in June. We waited until 2 years after President Obama's speech at the Cairo University. We had done a poll, a 1-year assessment. We wanted to do a 2-year assessment to see where the U.S. was in its relationship with the Arab world, based on the expectations that had been created in that speech. What we found was actually, should be quite distressing. It was not surprising, I think. To the president, it wasn't surprising. I had a chance to discuss it with him. But in fact, numbers have dropped significantly. Arab attitudes towards America were very low during the Bush administration. They had dropped during the term of President Bush, reached an all-time low in 2006, creeped back up in 2008, we think in expectation of change coming in America. In 2009, the numbers reached a very high level, in some countries double or triple the favorable ratings that had existed in 2008. In 2011, the numbers are lower than they were in the last year of the Bush administration. And lower than Iran's in every country except Saudi Arabia, where Iran has the lowest favorable ratings of any country we poll. What are the issues? The issues remain Palestine and U.S. interference across the Middle East. We are not popular in the region, and we need to understand that. I was on CNN, and Wolf Blitzer said, but we just assassinated bin Laden. We just got him, and we're in Libya. Doesn't that do something to improve our standing? And my response was sort of a weird thing that popped into my head. It's sort of like if your neighbor's been cheating, fooling around with your wife for the last 2 years, and all of a sudden one day comes over and takes your garbage out and mows your lawn. You're not going to say, oh, wow, that makes up for it. The issue that Arabs had with us was not Gaddafi. It was not bin Laden. The issue that Arabs have with us is a broader range of issues, and those two don't begin to scratch the surface of where the grievances are. The reason that the numbers got lower, I think, had to do obviously with expectations. They were raised very high. The Cairo speech and everything that preceded the Cairo speech created a sense that when we polled and that change was coming, and the president said change would come, and people believed him. When we polled on the first 100 days of the Obama administration, the question that we asked was, what do you look forward to most? What is the president saying that means the most to you? Interestingly, Guantanamo, closing Guantanamo was number 1. Leaving Iraq was number 2. And the commitment to solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue was number 3. And those three, none of those three have happened. The rest of the top list was engaging Iran, and that didn't really happen in the way people, I think, expected it to happen. And then outreach to the Muslim world, which has been obviously a focus of the administration, but people are even disappointed with that. In that context, it's interesting to note that the killing of bin Laden actually worsened attitudes. It was a kind of a, there was no love lost. Actually, after bin Laden and his camaraderie, his associates began to launch attacks, more attacks in Arab countries, attitudes towards bin Laden dropped rather significantly in the low single digits. He was not a popular figure in Arab countries, but killing him was simply a display of power coming from a country that is seen as being abusive of power. And so when we asked the question, have attitudes improved or worsened with the killing, we got worsened. And I think that it's worthy of note that, as I said, that the numbers are low and lower than they were in the last year of the Bush administration. Let me just draw your attention to some other things. If you look at chart B, we did a range of countries, and I think it's interesting to look at the range of countries because we'll look at it next. We'll look at Iran. Iran's numbers are very low across the board, except in Lebanon, where there's an internal problem in Lebanon that sort of puts Lebanon as the outlier in the Middle East. But those numbers are low. What's interesting, and you'll see when we look at the next poll, which is the Iran poll, Iran's numbers were very high up until 2006. Iran was looked at as the anti-United States. It was sort of like it was the Farrakhan factor. It was they're the baddest guys on the block. They're the ones who actually, stand up and defy America. Even in Saudi Arabia, Iran and Ahmadinejad had high numbers. There has been a steady erosion of Iran's favorable rating over the last 5 years, and today they're as low as they are, in large measure because Iran is seen in its own right instead of being seen as the counterpoint to American policy. It's interesting that when we did the Iran poll, the questions on Iran, we did not ask questions that we had asked in some earlier polls, which is contrasting Iran with America, or Israel has a nuclear weapon, should Iran, that kind of, or the UN says, what do you think about Iran? If you put Iran up against Israel or the United States, Iran wins. It's like they're bad, but these other guys are badder. If you look at Iran and we ask questions, what do you think about Iran's behavior in Bahrain? Or what do you think about Iran's involvement in Iraq? Or what do you think about Iran's behavior in Lebanon? People begin to focus on Iran just in its own right, what it's doing. Hence the Iran's favorable ratings very low, and its favorable ratings are low because its behavior in the region is viewed as interference and counterproductive. Other interesting one to note is Turkey's numbers, which are very high. And while Iran's numbers have dropped, I can just show you the chart here. This is, you can just see it a little bit, but this is the progression since 2006, a steady decline in almost every country. The only one, again, where Lebanon, where there was a sort of a mix-up in the numbers, I think largely, like I said, due to the internal complications of politics in Lebanon. Turkey's numbers, on the other hand, have steadily risen, in part due to the Palestine question and the role that Erdogan is playing on that issue, but also due to the fact that it is a democracy. It is a country that is viewed as representing its citizens. It's taking a leadership role in standing up to Israel, yes, but also the United States. And it's trying to make peace in the region. It tried to make peace between Israel and Syria. It tried to make peace with Iran and the West. And so the constructive role that Turkey is playing is giving it a leadership role. Final number to look at are the UN numbers, which are very low, relevant to the discussion today. The UN numbers in 2001 were very high. 2002, 3, and 4, they stayed high. Those numbers have now dropped. And they've dropped, I think, largely due to the fact that the UN became viewed less as an independent institution. We're talking now about the political side, not its institutional side, and more as simply carrying out American policy, facilitating American policy in the region. And so those numbers are very low. A last set of numbers to look at would be the numbers on Arab Spring and attitudes towards Arab Spring. We ask what we call the Reagan questions. Are you better off than you were? Do you think you'll be better off in the future? We use 5 years rather than 4. 4 is only relevant to America. So we use, are you better off than you were 5 years ago? Do you think you'll be better off in the next 5? Are your children going to be better off than you? In every country that we've polled, here's what we find. Are you better off today? And what we get is not sure. There's a tentativeness about this. In Egypt, the regime is gone, but nothing is solved. The only country actually that looks good and people are feeling good is Saudi Arabia and to some degree UAE. The two countries least touched by Arab Spring. The economy's doing well. Government's been responsive to the needs of folks. And they're feeling pretty secure about the present and about the future. But in the other countries, there's a sense of uncertainty, which I think is worthy of note. And the other thing that's worthy of note is, do you think you'll be better off in the future, and do you think your children will be better off than you are? The numbers are through the roof. In the 80% range, for example, in Egypt, yes, better off. That, to me, is worrisome, in that expectations are as high in Egypt about the future as they were with the election of Barack Obama, that America would change. And raising expectations when you haven't got the ability to meet them can be very dangerous, as we know. And I lied. There was one last point I wanted to make, and that was about, the GCC. Arab governments, some have changed. Leaders are gone. In some Arab governments, leaders haven't changed, but policy has changed. And one place you're seeing it is in the expanded role of the Gulf Cooperation Council in the Gulf region itself. And it, too, is a product of Arab Spring in an interesting way. It's as if Arabs have come to the realization that the West is not pulling chestnuts out of the fire. The protective umbrella that the West once provided, or the role that the West once played in helping to manage affairs, it no longer is going to happen. They've acted on their own. Another aspect of this in the context of Arab Spring is that Arab leaders are being responsive now to their own people in a way that they didn't have to before. Mubarak didn't have to listen. I was asked a question after the uprisings began in Egypt. The reporter said to me, do you think if we dumped Mubarak that our favorable ratings would go up in Egypt? And I said, you've got the question backwards. We're not unpopular in Egypt because we supported him. He's unpopular in Egypt because he supported us. And the simple fact is that Arab leaders are no longer going to be unquestioning supporters of our policies in the region. And therefore, and will act and defy America and act on their own when they feel that their interests require it. And you're seeing that regional assertiveness right now, in part from the GCC, but also from the Arab League itself. And I think Libya is an exception. Gaddafi pretty much had isolated himself and alienated himself from everybody, not just the West, but also the Arab world in general. Nobody liked him. I mean, it's like that kid in school that you'd say, what do you keep coming around for? Nobody likes you. He'd go to Arab League meetings, and you knew that as much as he was going to be outrageous at the UN, he'd be outrageous at the Arab League. declaring Libya is no longer an Arab country but African, and then making some outrageous thing about, encouraging Libyan men to marry African women to prove that Libya was an African country and no longer part of the Arab world. I mean, the guy was a buffoon and bizarre, and pursued policies that were extraordinarily disruptive. As bad as Assad is, and as bad as he yet can be, reaching the level of regional pariah, which is what had happened with Gaddafi, I'm not sure we're there yet. Not sure what he'd have to do to get there. Even at the worst as it is right now, as bad as it is right now, rather, people are looking for a compromise solution, something that they didn't look for in Libya. They wanted him gone. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. Geneive.
Thank you.
It's on.
It's on, okay. Hi, good morning. As Heather mentioned, I'm going to be talking, sort of just picking up where Jim left off to some degree, talking about what their motivations are, how Iran sees the Arab Spring, and I hope to also give you some specific information as to what Iran is actually doing. As Jim mentioned, Iran is not really in the place it hoped to be at this point in terms of Arab public opinion. But as we know from 30 years that the Islamic Republic has existed, they don't really pay attention to public opinion, either in their own country or elsewhere. So they are going about pursuing their own policies as they see in ways that they think will be most advantageous for the Islamic Republic. As you probably, I'll just sort of start from the beginning and try to explain how the story of Iran's involvement has changed since, say, the uprising in Egypt first began. When the uprising in Egypt first began and in Tunisia, Iran was very optimistic. They thought that this was the moment they had been waiting for since the Islamic Revolution, where governments would be overturned. There would, of course, be anti-Americanism sweeping the region, and they could capitalize to the utmost extent on this chaos and instability. And I'll just read you what Ayatollah Khamenei said at the time. This was in January. He said, "The events that are happening in North Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, and certain other countries have a different meaning for our nation. This is what has always been called the occurrence of Islamic awakening due to the victory of the great Islamic Revolution." So you can see how he was spinning this to make it seem as though all of these states would become Islamic states, and we are seeing that that's not the case. And he also tried to spin it to try to persuade both the audience at home and abroad that all of these revolutions were inspired by the Islamic Revolution, which occurred 30 years ago, which of course is not the case either. Since that time, of course, Iran has many more problems than it had in January. We see, of course, that President Assad's government is crumbling, and Iran relies heavily on Syria for its whole regional its whole regional calculation, its regional stability. We also see that, of course, the Saudis invaded Bahrain, and I'll speak about that in a moment. And we also see that there's been a revolution in Egypt, and it's very unclear, for example, which political forces will prevail. So things haven't turned out exactly the way Iran had hoped. However, that has not discouraged the regime from meddling in the region. I'll first talk about Syria. As you all probably know, the relationship with Assad has been a very solid one. And as time has gone on and Assad has become, the violence has increased and there's been more instability, of course, it's a complete human rights disaster. Iran has really stepped up the ways that it is helping Assad stay in power, because obviously now the situation is very critical. Some of these specific techniques that the Iranians are doing, well, first of all, of course, they're shipping arms to Syria. And we know this from U.S. intelligence reports, from intelligence from Arab governments, and we also know it from the Turks. The Turks, at least on 2 occasions, have intercepted arms being shipped to Iran. The Iranians are also helping the Syrians in manipulating the internet and in identifying activists, dissidents, because they've become masters at this on their own soil. The 2009, if you remember, the demonstrations in Iran were crushed significantly after about 6 months, even though the Iranians in the summer of 2009 were able to get as many as a few million protesters on the streets of Tehran. The authorities were able to crush the uprising. Now it's a bit unfortunate, but the opposition is pretty much, I wouldn't say it's certainly not dead, but it cannot mobilize people on the streets any longer, except in sort of isolated protests. But in terms of a great protest movement, that movement doesn't exist right now. So the Iranians have a lot to teach President Assad, and they've been very effective in doing so. We know from human rights reports, from Amnesty International, that there's a lot that the Syrians have been very successful at monitoring the internet, monitoring cell phones. A lot of this technological know-how they've received from the Iranians. We also know from intelligence, for example, that the elite, the Special Al-Quds Force, this paramilitary force that operates within the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, at least according to U.S. intelligence, has had some presence in Syria. So this is sort of what Iran is doing in Syria because they feel greatly under threat. I think the other relationship that hasn't gone so well for Iran is the Turkish-Iranian relationship, as Jim mentioned. And I've made several trips to Turkey since the uprising began, and it's very interesting because when the Turks were sort of playing the role of interlocutor between the Americans and the Iranians, they were very hopeful that they could actually bring the Iranians to the negotiating table to talk about the nuclear issue, and they were also very hopeful that their own relationship with Iran would be very effective and very helpful in Iran's relationship with many countries, not only the United States. But the Turks, from the experience with the Syrian uprising, the Turks now have a very different view of Iran. They understand that their relationship with Iran now is very complicated. They weren't aware of that before. And they also understand, I think, that it's very hard to negotiate with a country or to even negotiate on behalf of a country where you don't really ever know if its policy one day is going to be the same the next day. And so the Turks are very frustrated with the Iranian relationship now, and they are also speaking out very publicly against Assad, as you probably all read in the newspapers, and the Iranians have reacted very negatively toward the statements that have been coming from Turkey. So again, we see another state where the current AK party, their policy had been no trouble with its neighbors. Now they have a lot of trouble with their neighbors, as does Iran. So we are seeing that these two great powers in the region, that the Arab uprising has definitely affected what they thought their policies would be over the next few years. The last point that I'll make is about Ahmadinejad himself. Obviously, we're here to talk about the UN, and he is one of the last, I guess, authoritarian figures still standing. He will come to the UN. There had been a lot of discussion about whether he would come or not. He will make an appearance at the UN. You probably read the news that the hikers have been released, the American hikers that were charged. Part of that is in preparation for his trip here so that he can have some goodies to sort of show for the regime as he makes what is probably going to be a very antagonistic speech at the UN, as it always is. And I think what's important, though, to realize about whatever he says at the UN is that he himself, as a political leader, has been marginalized in Iran. He's not, the regime now has completely isolated him and his political faction, and they are making preparations so that his faction does not win any seats or even is allowed to run in the upcoming parliamentary elections, which will be in March. So in the context of, I guess, the Middle East relationships, I think it's important to remember that Ahmadinejad has been marginalized, and also it's important to remember that as president, he never had very much power. So the kinds of policies that I've talked about in Iran's relationship with its neighbors, these are regime policies. They don't depend necessarily on one man. I mean, they largely depend on Khamenei, but believe it or not, there is a bit of a rule by consensus within the regime. So it's important to understand that Iran's policies don't depend on the president, and that whatever Ahmadinejad says at the UN, it's not to be taken so seriously because he's been marginalized. And I think a specific example of that has been his comments on Syria over the last few days. The New York Times ran a huge story, which was a bit misguided, about how the Iranians now are criticizing Assad on his human rights record. But yesterday, Ahmadinejad retracted those statements. So you can see that he was sort of talking out of turn. And the regime's policy towards Syria has been a very consistent one, as have their policies in the region in general. They are having a little problem now with the Arab Spring, but they are continuing to pursue their policies that they have had in place over the last 30 years. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. I want to shift us back to New York and kind of the politics of the UN, but also get a little bit into the institutional roles that are being played in the Arab Spring and kind of step back and try to capture where we are in a moment of time, because I think we might either be at a somewhat remarkable high watermark in terms of the role of the UN in asserting certain principles, including human rights, and attaching real meaning to that when it comes to actions on the ground. Or at a moment where, as was suggested, Libya is the exception to the rule, and the rule is going to continue to be that the UN is, its member states are preoccupied mostly with protecting sovereignty and not asserting larger international principles. So are we at a moment where, looking back at, in particular at the Libya action, where it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back? And I would throw in there Cote d'Ivoire, by the way, which we don't have time to get into, but Cote d'Ivoire is a really interesting example of a much more assertive UN role. Or are we 1 step forward and 2 steps back? And I would just, for those that follow the UN, recall that diplomats really like precedents. And when it comes time to write the next resolution, there's a lot of reliance on what the last resolution said. And so you can't completely write off the Libya example as a one-off, stars were aligned kind of moment. I think the Libya example, and I'll go into that in a little more detail, and then Syria and some other things, really gets at the heart of responsibility to protect as this new principle and operationalizing it for the first time in a meaningful way. The way it played out, however, particularly with the very, even though some people felt it wasn't robust enough, very robust action by NATO, really quickly became an argument that was, we're taking sides in an internal conflict. Those who were opposed to it felt that this was really regime change. This was using the UN as a pretext for what the US and the West wanted, and it was a big mistake. And it had immediate repercussions in the debate on Syria, which I'll get to. But I think it's one case where, if you look at the actual pace of action on Libya, really unprecedented. You had, action by the Human Rights Council on February 25th, special session to look at the human rights issues there, and recommending that Libya be suspended from the Human Rights Council. The next day, the General Assembly, which is lightning speed when it comes to the UN, the next day the General Assembly passes a consensus vote resolution suspending Libya from the Human Rights Council. You have, not much later after that, the Security Council resolution, February 26, on Resolution 1970, extending sanctions to the Gaddafi regime, referring the situation to the International Criminal Court, arms embargo, including that covered foreign mercenaries, all, and this was noteworthy as a consensus action as well. And then just 3 weeks later, about on March 17th, Security Council passes another resolution, 1973, on establishing the no-fly zone and authorizing force to protect civilians. And if you look at that resolution, you can see that the primary concern throughout the text is on protection of civilians and humanitarian assistance. And at the very end, there's a little bit of lip service paid to the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity of the state of Libya, which is really ironic when juxtaposed to the rest of the text. And it's clear that the view was that seeing Libya as a threat to international peace and security trumped the concern for sovereignty. And if you roll back just a few years earlier to the debate in the Security Council around Myanmar and around Zimbabwe, where those were somewhat similar in that they were core human rights abuses, violations of democratic elections, et cetera, taking place in those countries, and action was blocked in the Security Council, mostly by China and Russia exercising their veto threats, and joined by South Africa as well. So, the case has shifted in terms of what really is a threat to international peace and security. Now, I think there were some interesting factors in the Libya case. The actual actions of the Libyan diplomats in New York, I think, certainly had some persuasive effect in defecting from the regime and asking for this kind of help. The Arab League's role, and not just the Arab League, but also the African Union and the Organization of Islamic Conference, or I think it's now Cooperation, condemning the violations in Libya, really provided the right political context for a very assertive action. There was one other interesting feature, which is the concern for the safety of foreign nationals, which I think did make it feel more like an international security issue. But of course, there's a lot of history, as you referenced, to Gaddafi's bizarre behavior, and maybe this was the time just to get rid of him. But of course, the way it played out, as I referred to before, really rankled a lot of other member states. So in shifting on to Syria, which was not just far behind in time of what was happening in Syria, and it was beginning on a similar path. The Human Rights Council taking action, calling a special session, and requesting that the Office of the High Commissioner, send a fact-finding mission to report on the human rights situation, and then in August. You see, after the Libya story evolving, the West, the EU and the US, cannot get a Security Council resolution on Syria, despite widespread, in-your-face violations being committed in Syria, really worse than what we were seeing in Libya. And I think it was very much a reaction to the way things were playing out in Libya. The way the presidential statement, instead of resolution, there was a presidential statement which was watered down because states, not just China and Russia, but also India and Brazil and South Africa, who are really, as we're watching their role play out, asserting very much this core principle of non-intervention, protection of sovereignty, and really resisting the quick turn to sanctions and military action in dealing with internal crises. I mean, a much stronger preference for mediation, or and diplomacy, which is what you think the UN is supposed to be doing first and foremost. And that whole story of the role of the UN in the diplomacy has gotten lost. And there's the ghost of Iraq hanging over all of this, of course. That not enough was done on the diplomatic front. On Libya, I wonder if anyone knows that, in fact, there was a senior official appointed to be the negotiator in Libya, former foreign minister of Jordan. But he was kind of buried in the story. Instead, you saw generals in uniform talking about what was going on in Libya, and the UN political role was really missing from the scene. And so a concern that not happen again in Syria. And this statement that came out in August talks about it's more balanced in the sense that calling for a stop on attacks against state institutions, so not just against the protesters. So an effort to maybe avoid taking sides in the middle of an internal conflict. So no action, just at least a consensus statement, no action. But just 3 weeks later, There's another special session at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva on Syria, in which a report is presented finding, widespread systematic human rights violations, 2,200 innocent people killed, and creating a commission of inquiry to go in and look deeper. That resolution was adopted by a vote of 33 to 4 to 9. And the 33 that voted for it include 4 Arab states, including Saudi Arabia. So I think, there's a clear sense of where they're coming out on this. The 4 against include Russia and China and Cuba. So the Human Rights Council is turning out to be an important place where the human rights element of the story, which is really critical and central, is getting the attention it deserves, is leading to investigations and reporting and monitoring. The commission that was appointed yesterday by the Human Rights Council is led by Sergio Pinheiro, a Brazilian who has vast experience doing exactly this kind of work in the UN system, and it's very encouraging. They also appointed a Turk, a woman who also has been operating in the UN system, and an American with experience in Palestine. So it's an interesting group, and I expect that they will do some serious work. Whether they get into the country or not is another matter. So that's kind of the story on Syria. Let me now just very quickly, in the interest of time, talk about the 2 other big stories in the region, of course, which are Tunisia and Egypt. And here it becomes more a story of the institutional response. Where the UN Secretariat and all the other UN agencies are stepping up to the plate. Very quickly in the Tunisia story, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights sent an assessment mission to talk to the transitional government actors and to get a process going to really identify what were their needs. And I think there's a fairly robust and detailed strategy that UNDP has the lead on to support the democratic transition in Tunisia. So that's noteworthy. And UNDP, which used to be allergic to any of these democratic governance issues, is really becoming a central player when it comes to democratic governance. It ends up being, over 40% of their funding goes towards, political party reform, judicial reform, et cetera. In the case of Egypt, it was a lower profile, I would say. You had the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Lynn Pascoe, leading 2 high-level UN missions to Egypt to meet with the interim leaders and to figure out ways of supporting the political transition there. And they've held, different seminars where they're bringing together leaders from other democratic transitions around the world, from Latin America and Africa and Asia, to tell their story and to kind of help the Egyptians figure that out. All sounds like kind of good Boy Scouty things to do, but at least they're doing it, and the Egyptians are welcoming it. And then, of course, there's all the humanitarian work that the UN does in these situations. And UNHCR, in particular, with the International Organization of Migration, has played a really major role in dealing with the fallout of the Libya crisis and the hundreds of thousands of migrants and refugees in Tunisia, in Egypt, and elsewhere in coping with that problem. I would also note just briefly on Bahrain, which we didn't really get to, and we might in the Q&A, is that we don't have any action on Bahrain, which goes back to the core facts of life when it comes to the UN politics, that there is no taste in the United States for doing anything on Bahrain. There's been quite a bit of efforts within the NGO human rights community to get the U.S. to do something on Bahrain. They are not going to touch it. Of course, Saudi Arabia and other key Arab states don't want the UN to get involved in Bahrain. I think that will continue. Yemen is beginning to percolate on the UN agenda, and there will be an interactive dialogue on Monday at the UN Human Rights Council to talk about the situation in Yemen. And there's a UN special advisor on Yemen who's been playing a key role in trying to negotiate a peaceful settlement to that dispute. So, there the UN is playing its appropriate role. On some of the questions Heather, that you threw out a very big question about where the Arab Spring fits in general democratization trends and how will the new Middle East change the UN. Those are like a whole nother hour-long discussion, I think. But just to say, the new Middle East, as we saw Turkey's going to be a bit of a wild card, I think, because there are a lot of domestic political pressures in Turkey that are pushing the government in a certain direction. But nonetheless, they're still anchored in NATO and in the West, and they're still playing that role. I mean, they have a very pro-human rights democracy voting record, actually, at the UN. In contrast to states like India or South Africa or Indonesia, Turkey actually has a much better voting record on those issues. But I think it remains to be seen. I think you're going to see that similar trend play out with Egypt, with Tunisia, with some of these other countries, as they feel more subject to public pressure on their foreign policies, that there's going to be some shifting going on. And it's going to affect the United States, it's going to affect Israel, it's going to affect the whole Middle East, and we're in the process of some really fascinating changes. So I am optimistic that it will be 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But I think there are so many wild cards out there that we'll wait and see.
Great, thanks. I'm going to abuse the prerogative of the chair because, Ted, I think you framed a really central question here, and it's so striking between what Jim said about the fall off in attitudes in the Arab world toward the UN, on the one hand, and at the same time as in Libya, but also, of course, with Palestine, and even with Syria, how you see the UN playing a much more prominent role in the region's affairs and being used by the states of the region to play a more prominent role in its affairs than has been the case in a while. And so, Jim and Geneive, I wanted to invite you each to comment on the question of, are we going to recede from this high water mark in terms of the UN involvement, or are we going to see a region that's much more interested in sort of working with and using the UN for its purposes? And then to all three of you, does that open any opportunities for the U.S., or is it there's a temptation looked at through the prism of Palestine and U.S. domestic politics to view this as a purely negative development, but are there positive developments here for the U.S. as well? Geneive, should we start with you?
Sure. I'll answer that question by talking about Bahrain, which I neglected to talk about. Bahrain is a really interesting story in many respects. First of all, to some degree now, and as Jim mentioned, the more prominent role of the GCC is definitely on display in Bahrain. As you probably recall, in March, the Saudis sent troops into Bahrain and basically have, to make sure that the government did not fall and to crush the uprising. That posed a big problem for the United States. There was an attempt, Ambassador Feltman went to Bahrain. There was an attempt to reach some negotiations between the opposition and the government, and those negotiations failed. So the United States failed to broker any sort of agreement. And this has become a big problem also for the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia's involvement in Bahrain. In addition to all of that, there are also gross human rights violations being committed in Bahrain even today. You probably read in the news that there were people, some of the doctors have been on a hunger strike. So from the view of the Bahrainis, particularly the Shia and those involved in the opposition, they are looking for, they don't believe they can rely on the United States any longer. And they were very, very disappointed that at what they seem to, they were disappointed by what they see as a duplicitous policy, that while the United States was supporting the Egyptian uprising, the U.S. did not publicly support the uprising in Bahrain. So in the case of Bahrain, they are looking for new world actors. And I think that in the case of the UN, they would be very happy, for example, if the same kind of investigation were to occur in Bahrain about the human rights violations as is occurring in Syria. So there is I think that despite everything that's happened, there is still this sense in the region, and maybe Jim's polling might indicate otherwise, that the United States can come in and save the day. And I think that certainly was what a lot of Bahrainis told me. So absent of the United States, yes, I think that they would look to an organization, an institution like the UN to intervene, because there don't seem to be any solutions in the case of Bahrain at this point.
Jim, do you want to jump in on any of that?
I mean, regardless of everything we've talked about, the ultimate test of the relevance of the UN to the region is going to be how this issue of Palestinian statehood is handled in September. It is it is not decisive by any measure. In some ways, it'll be a hollow victory if the Palestinians win a resolution. You're not going to get a state through a resolution. You're going to get a moral victory. They desperately need one and ought not to be denied it. The Israelis are becoming hysterical, have been hysterical for months, pointless hysteria. It's a kind of a temper tantrum more than anything that certainly has everybody here in town shook up. I mean, the New York Times editorial yesterday, which overall wasn't bad, beginning with a UN vote would be ruinous. I mean, I just don't know how votes become ruinous of anything. The Post today is worse. Reminds me in 1988, I did a platform resolution at the Democratic National Convention calling for mutual recognition, territorial compromise, and self-determination for both Israelis and Palestinians. By today's measure, I mean, basically a silly little thing. I mean, it was very little, but I was told at the time, if you even raise this at the convention, you will destroy the Democratic Party, and the destruction of the Democratic Party will be on your head. We did raise it. We had a platform debate at the convention. We had a demonstration on the floor. And the Democratic Party still exists. To the best of my knowledge, it's there. I'm the chair of the Resolutions Committee of the Democratic Party, which obviously, means something. And yet this sense of creating hysteria in order to get your way is something that's been going on for a long time on this issue. And it's one of the reasons why the credibility of the institution is as low as it is in the Middle East. Iraq certainly played a role, but so too have several other instances where the UN became more is viewed more as a shill for American policy, and we used it and abused it more than the other way around. We're not following the world body as much as the world body's using us, and if Eliana Ross-Leihtenen's resolution passes, which pretty much ties U.S. funding to the UN generally, to its behavior on Palestine, it'll be a real blow for the credibility of the body in the Arab world. So I think that you're right. There are interesting steps. The Libya thing was important. If we looked at how it evolved, I mean, it really begins with the GCC. And then the GCC kind of gave the blessing to the Arab League. And the Arab League then gave the blessing to the West to do what it did. Syria as well, I think it was the GCC and that actually first said the killing had to stop. And then from that regional statement, you had an Arab League initiative, et cetera, moving forward. As I said, I don't think it'll go as far as the Libyan one for a lot of regional reasons. Libya could fall off the earth and it would, oil would not go to Italy and France, but the consequences of Syria are so much greater in terms of the regional role that not just that Syria's regime has played, but just look at the neighborhood. I mean, you got Iraq on one side and Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan. I mean, there's a lot of consequences to how Syria plays out, plus a large Palestinian refugee population very much tied to that issue. I mean, for a lot of reasons, there's a lot of concern about instability in Syria and where that may take us. I think Bahrain is an interesting one in that while I think the regime handled it badly and continues to handle it badly, it's on a low simmer rather than a boil. And it's not going away. We'll hear about it for a long time to come. But there is this Iran Arab Gulf states tension that is going to continue to play out for a long time to come. This is the danger, I think, of the U.S. no longer being able to play that kind of leadership role, is that you've now got that tension there, but there's no independent outside role. And so Bahrain is a problem looking for not a solution so much as looking for someone to help find a solution. And that's where the role that the U.S. was once seen to play or once thought itself playing is now, we've forfeited that role. So we can't really do that. And it would be nice if the UN could step in, but the UN is still seen as a more steered by us than being an independent actor. So I think we're in a transitional mode in this situation, and I think we'll see it whether or not it's able to play out. Clearly, there is a role there waiting to be played and looking for an actor to play it. The question is, who will that actor be? Will it be a state? Will it be a group of states like the EU? Or will it be, the UN? Will the UN actually be able to put itself in a position of being seen as an independent actor? I don't know where this will come out at the end. But it's not just states that are changing, but it's the chemistry almost of the world community that's changing.
Ted.
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, I totally agree with what you just said about the Israel-Palestine issue. And then I'm glad you mentioned what's going on here in Washington on some of these issues and the politics here, because it relates to all of this. And there's obviously a lot of dissonance between how the U.S. and the UN are viewed in the region, and then flip side here, the way it's played out on Capitol Hill is that the UN is somehow against the U.S. and doing terrible things to our national interests. And when you really line it all up, the UN has been a great instrument in many ways for what U.S. goals are. And I think this administration has very effectively used the UN to achieve what it set out to do. It's really hard to line those things up. And of course, what you say is heard not just in Washington, but it's heard all around the world. And lining those things up and trying to find the right messaging is a very tricky thing to do when it comes to public diplomacy. I think in terms of the positive side of the equation for the U.S., if the Arab states, as they evolve, have more buy-in to the UN system and the basically international rules of the game, starting with some of the basic values of democracy and human rights, I think that will be a big plus for the U.S. I mean, that fits with our overall arching strategic view that a world made up of democracies at peace is good for the United States. But I think a lot of it hangs, frankly, on what happens in the elections in the U.S. After 2012. I mean, you have certain voices in the Republican Party, and we see it very clearly in the Ross-Leighton legislation that would take this in a very different direction, that would assert very strongly a muscular U.S. unilateral point of view that will really hurt our ability to work through the UN and other multilateral mechanisms to support these kinds of transitions in the rest of the world. So I think that's really going to be one of the critical issues to watch in the race to see how that plays out next year. Because you really do, again, depend on who the nominee is and the emphasis, but I think it's there, it's in the cards right now that you're going to set up a real debate about U.S. foreign policy and what role it should play going forward. And the UN is kind of a pretty key component of that debate.
Great. We'll now open it up to questions from the audience. Please identify yourself and please make your question actually a question. Yeah, over here.
Thanks. I'm Bridget Morse with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Thanks very much for a very interesting panel and discussion. I have sort of a big issue to throw out and would welcome responses from people on the panel, and then a very specific question. The big issue is kind of the other story about what this moment means in terms of global politics and democratic change, and that's about the role of nonviolence and the remarkable dedication to nonviolent strategies and tactics in the region that have pushed changes, which is not uniform, and Libya is kind of the outlier in terms of choosing a nonviolent methods instead. But, what does that mean? And commentary on that would be welcome. The other, and just to say that the Palestinian approach to the UN is also a nonviolent tactic to try to push change in the situation. The other specific question is, if the U.S. does want to now help stimulate more positive change, improve its reputation and its relationships in the region, what are the one or two things that you would recommend the U.S. do in terms of its policy?
So what's the role of nonviolence, and what are the one or two things the U.S. can do to improve its position? Easy questions. Geneive, maybe we'll start with you.
I'll tackle the one about what the U.S. should do. I think that in the case of most of these countries in transition, I would say that most people believe that the United States should highlight human rights greater than it does now. That's certainly true in the case of Iran, it's true in Bahrain, it's true in Syria. And I think that no matter whether Assad stays in power, no matter if there's actually, no matter if, for example, the opposition in Bahrain actually is able to extract compromises from the government, no matter who ends up playing a prominent role, for example, in the future Egyptian government, I think that where, at least in some Arab states, people see a very important role for the United States is to focus on human rights. And I think that there is a feeling in the region that the United States has disappointed Arab populations and certainly has disappointed the Iranians on this issue.
Jim.
Part of this problem, part of this discussion about human rights in the United States is we still see ourselves as the city on the hill, and we're not. And that's not how the world sees us anymore. I mean, after Iraq and Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and black sites and torture, and everything that's happened with Palestine that we turned a blind eye to, we're just not there anymore. I mean, and so having us lecture someone on human rights is like having Hugh Hefner do a marriage encounter class. It doesn't resonate, And so the question is, what do we have to do to get right with God, to give ourselves back the legitimacy that we want, or at least not even give ourselves back, but get the legitimacy that we want? I mean, we were once able to do it out of power. We were able to set terms because we were the powerful one. The irony of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan was that the Project for New American Century model was that we would use overwhelming force decisively, demonstrating that we were the invaluable country and that we would buy ourselves another century of hegemony. It worked out the opposite. It left us weaker. It left us more divided at home. It left us resource poor. It left our military overstretched. It showed that ragtag insurgents in two countries could, drive us nuts, and it emboldened regional powers to defy us, like Pakistan or Iran, and put us in a horrible situation, and brought out the worst in terms of our behavior, which we're still defending. I mean, in Cheney's book and in some of our own policies. And in terms of our domestic approach, I mean, we threw caution and Constitution to the wind. I mean, the last decade has been devastating for who we are. We're in trouble, and we have to face that. And I agree with you. I mean, the debate in 2012 needs to be about what future. Where are we going? And when I hear Republicans wanting to go back to what Bush did, and chiding President Obama for not doing more of bombing this or doing it. Never met a war they didn't like, these guys, It's dangerous. The choices we will make will be absolutely critical. And the backbone that this administration needs to take a different path will be critical. And a test is going to be at the UN. And how we deal with that issue. We have gone out on a limb that is a treacherous, dangerous course for us to take. Isolating ourselves in a part of the world where we do not need to be we don't need a self-inflicted wound in the Arab world right now at all with this Palestine thing. And yet we've given every indication that that's where we're going, which would be a big mistake. On the issue of nonviolence, I think Tunisia was extraordinary There's a backstory there about the role of labor that we haven't talked about. Labor in Egypt, also a huge role. There had been mass demonstrations in Egypt for years, and the organizers that led the revolt came out of those institutions and have done a remarkable job. The Muslim Brotherhood comes in late in both places, and there is an internal tussle going on, but it remains for the most part peaceful. Libya changed the narrative, becoming a different story. Yemen has always been a different narrative. Syria has been, again, remarkably peaceful, despite the fact that there have been episodes of violence here or there coming from protesters, and some not protesters, but organized gangs doing what they do, border smugglers, etc. But it has been largely peaceful, and I think there's been a strategic approach to that I think is important. Bahrain was another example of a largely peaceful thing, and despite the fact that it was crushed, it has not died, and I think remains. One has to hope that it stays on that peaceful course. These have been inspirational. I think that the problem I had with Libya and our intervention in Libya was that it changed the narrative a bit. It said, oh, this is the way we'll do it. We'll send in bombing raids and drones and win it that way. Becomes a very different story than the one that was there. But this is still all playing out. But I think, and we'll see with Palestine and with the Palestinians on the ground, how they respond to the UN vote or non-vote, or passage or non-passage. But if a peaceful movement grows there, stays peaceful, is disciplined and peaceful, it could be a huge transformative event in the region.
So Ted, I wonder if I can pick on you to draw these two threads together a little bit, actually, because you and I worked together in the State Department at a moment where there was a really interesting, nonviolent, and ultimately triumphant movement in Yugoslavia. And we know that some of the activists in Egypt and elsewhere actually talked to former Otpor student activists. And the interesting thing is that this ties back to a number of roots to Gandhi, but also to Martin Luther King. And so there's a way that this shining city on a hill, the what do we have to do to get right with God, that the glorious things about the American past are very much being drawn on. And the great sort of tragedy of our moment is not being able to access that.
Can I just make one observation about Egypt, though, and the point you make is so important to not forget. And that is, without any disrespect to any other Arab country, Egypt has always been unique. It was the one place in the Arab world where you would sit in a coffee shop and talk about Latin American politics, or talk about what was going on in India. The rest of the Arab world is focused on the Arab world or on its particular country. And Egypt always had a civilizational view, a larger view. So it never surprised me when the demonstrations began that they began to talk about Gene Sharp and about different. I mean, that's just what Egyptian young people and intellectuals do. Is they see themselves as part of a bigger universe of intellectual ideas, and they want to be a participant in that.
And all the more reason why it's important to get Egypt right. I mean, if Egypt then also has an outward influence in the rest of the Arab world, which is what is constantly remarked upon in our media, then I think spreading that message to other parts of the Arab world from Egypt will be critically important. But building on a couple of these thoughts and the strategic value of nonviolence, I think, is really coming through in what we're seeing in some of these protests, particularly as in those Tunisia, Egypt, and now Syria. There's a very good piece by Ariel Dorfman, who's a Chilean writer, who reflected on comparing the way the United States reacted to 9/11 and the other 9/11 that happened in Chilean history, which is when General Pinochet and the military went in and deposed Salvador Allende and ruled with an iron fist for 17 years. And what he commented on was the way the Chileans dealt with that trauma. It wasn't to take up arms. although there certainly was a faction that did that. It was a very small minority faction, didn't get anywhere. But the average Chilean, just chipped away at it year after year and building organizations and, educating people in some of the basic values of how to reclaim their tradition of democracy, which was, strong in Chile, and eventually defeated Pinochet in a plebiscite that he himself thought he would win, and we know the rest of the story. Chile is a fascinating, successful democracy in Latin America. You look at the United States' reaction to 9/11, and it's been militaristic, divisive, and all the consequences that Jim pointed out we're now living with. We are a weaker country, there's no question about it, than we were before 9/11. And so our ability to project our values, I think, is also weakened in the rest of the world. And whether we can reclaim it or not and get right with God, we'll see. But I think we have a lot of a lot more self-reflection and education to do in our own country on these issues.
We had a question.
Hello there, my name is Emma Krause. I'm an intern at DC. Oh, thank you.
My name is Emma Krause. I'm an intern at DC, waiting to start at the State Department. My question to all of you is, with us to expect Palestine to introduce this resolution to the UN, and also with yesterday's New York Times article from the Prince of Turkey asserting that the U.S. should support this, what do you think the Iranian reaction would be if Saudi Arabia were to fund a Palestinian state or to really help that initiative along? What would the reaction be, I guess, in Iran and other areas there as well?
I'm going to suggest you hand the mic to the gentleman next to you who also had his hand up, and we'll take 2 questions at a time.
My name's Matt Eckel. I'm basically here on my own accord today, but I had actually a follow-up question for Geneive. You had said that you'd heard a lot of people say that one of the things the U.S. could do would be to have a greater focus on human rights. What does that mean concretely in some places like Syria, some place like Bahrain? Is this just rhetorical? Are there really concrete steps that the United States can take that would be realistic, given strategic commitments and the calculations that have been made around those issues? Just a bit more specifically, kind of, what does that mean?
Well, I think that what it means in concrete terms, I'll just give you a little insight into some conversations I had in Bahrain. Some of the people in the opposition, I met lawyers, I met doctors, various sort of a cross-section of people who have been involved in the opposition. They basically said that, we followed what President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton said in the beginning of our uprising. They made positive statements about the uprising, so we went out and demonstrated. And then suddenly, the Americans weren't able to broker a deal. And so I think that we sometimes underestimate the power, despite everything that's been said in this room today, the diminishing power of the United States. Nevertheless, I think that we sitting here underestimate the power of even statements that come out of the administration. And, the Iranians, for example, take very seriously any public statements made about their poor human rights record. And there has now been appointed a special rapporteur for Iran that will investigate Iran's human rights violations. And there's now a lot of back and forth as to whether he'll be allowed to actually go to Iran, but it seems that the Iranians are going to permit this in the end, and they're already sort of scripting what his trip will look like. We've been told that they're sort of making Evin Prison, which is a notorious prison in Iran, look like a bed and breakfast now, and they've released political prisoners. So you see, it does have some effect. The simple appointment of an investigator who is going to look into the human rights violations in Iran has already changed regime behavior in a very small way and in a scripted way, but it's made a difference. So I think that to some degree I'm a bit in disagreement with what Jim said about, yes, we're not looked, I think there's a difference between American power and specifically what the United States can do on specific issues that are of concern to populations, particularly those that haven't overthrown their current governments.
Can I jump? I'm so glad you mentioned the Iran Special Rapporteur example. It's a good example of the Human Rights Council taking initiative on such a glaring case. It took a while, but they did it, and they've appointed a former foreign minister of the Maldives, which is a Muslim country, and that'll be interesting to see whether he, in his personal capacity, wearing the UN flag, can make a difference. But what I did a lot of research on this very issue of what kind of role do the UN special procedures, the rapporteurs, make on the ground. And the example Geneive gave is very much echoes across the board in so many different countries, where just even the appointment of them, but actually when they get on the ground and talk to human rights activists and talk to victims and then get access to the highest level of government, they can really make a difference. And it's precisely because they carry the UN flag in doing this that they're heard. So the UN, as well as the US, still has a lot of legitimacy to open doors and make a difference. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, don't appreciate it, but if you're interested, it's all documented in a report that we released last year.
Jim, what about the Saudis?
Look, if I had my choice between the Iranians belly aching in the region about Palestinians being under occupation and being humiliated and having land taken through confiscations, etc., and the Iranians belly aching about the fact that Saudi Arabia was funding a Palestinian state, I'd take the latter any day of the week. I think moving that agenda forward and creating some positive indicators of progress for Palestinians is absolutely critical. Iran preys off of this issue and is able to. I wrote a piece one time saying that Israel is not the target of Iran; it's the foil. It's the game that Iran uses to sort of play off of the resentment that Arabs have for Israeli behavior, and they're very effectively able to do it. One of the great ways of diminishing Iran and its role in the region and its attractiveness to the alienated and disenfranchised and angry is move that agenda forward and solve it. That's what the Saudis know. That's what General Petraeus knew. That's what General Schwarzkopf knew. That's what Jim Baker knew. That's what we've historically always understood on a leadership level. But our politics always gets in the way of us doing something to make that happen. And I think the Saudis have pretty much given up on the fact that we're going to make it happen. They're figuring, like, if we have to do it, we'll try to do it on our own, if to the extent to which we can. I mean, we're still invaluable or essential, not as a mediator, but we may be the only place that can still, pull the plug on Israeli behavior, although we seem loath to ever do that. And so, I thought that the Prince Turki's piece was an important indicator. He wouldn't have written it if he didn't have some go ahead to do it, and I think it's an indication of the fact that folks in the region are pretty frustrated with the paralysis here and or counterproductive behavior here on that issue, which they're looking to as being very important right now.
Okay, we'll take two questions over here together.
Thanks. Daphne McCurdy with POMED. This panel has discussed in great length America's diminishing power, and that also definitely stands true for Western Europe. And so this is, underscores that the UN Security Council doesn't reflect the current global order. So I'm just wondering where we stand on calls for reform with the Security Council, if that's still on the agenda.
If you could hand it to the woman in white behind you.
Thanks. My name is Maria Stefan. I work at State Department, but I've done some writing on civil resistance, including in the Middle East. I guess two questions. One is, looking at Syria, what are the indicators that you would focus on to know that the Assad regime is significantly weakening? So what would be the key indicators? And secondly, on Israel-Palestine, I fear that a lot of the good work that we're doing in a number of these countries, including Syria, where we have a really remarkable ambassador who's showing solidarity and just doing some pretty impressive stuff on the ground. I fear that that is being diminished by, you know, certain other policies in the region, including possibly Israel-Palestine. And my question is, you know, what do you think would be a turning point? What would actually change U.S. policy today towards that conflict? Is it something that would have to happen, you know, inside Israel-Palestine? Is it something that would have to happen in our domestic politics with a different lobby? What would need to happen today to change the calculus? Thanks.
So, Ted, I think Security Council reform has your name written all over it, and then maybe we'll take the second question as a chance for everybody to give a final set of comments about, given everything that's been said today, what most needs to change in U.S. policy.
I think the Security Council reform story is pretty brief at this point, although it's going to take a long time to play out, which is that it is still on the agenda. Very much, and we have, you know, Japan, Germany, and India and Brazil, you know, at the door, and that has become such an important issue for those states, and thinking in particular of Brazil, where it determines a lot of the other things that they do in their foreign policies. I mean, a lot of people felt that their effort to work with Turkey on Iran was an example of Brazil's efforts to show that they belong in the Security Council, that they can play with the big boys, and that they could be taken seriously. Have completely backfired for them. But I think it's an issue that will not go away. I think there are various behind-the-scenes negotiations and discussions going on about different formulas so that you would find a way to get some of these states on the Security Council but without a veto, and would they be willing to accept that, et cetera. But I still think it's going to take many years before that solution is found, but it's not going to go away, and it'll keep at it. And I'm going to defer to the others on what's happening in Syria and indicators of Assad's fall.
Okay, I'll attempt that one. I think the first indicator would be if President Assad's minority faction within the military, the Alawites, if they start defecting. I think that that's definitely an indicator that he's in more trouble than he is now. And I think the other indicator, which is very important, and we've seen some of the criticism already, is if the mercantile class leaves the regime, and if they become also part of the opposition in cities like Aleppo. So I think that those would be two important indicators. But I just want to speak to the general question. I guess not only the Arab uprisings, but we have seen even before the Arab awakening that, as Jim mentioned, governments in the region have taken it upon themselves to try to reach a compromise on the Palestinian-Israeli issue and on other issues. And I think that what we're going to see going forward is that this has been a very empowering experience, obviously, for all of these societies in transition. And I think that they will continue to look to the United States, but very selectively, for support, for an expression of American power, as I've said on the human rights issue. And I think that the day when, you know, we could have a great influence, say, in Israel-Palestine, as a country that's going to broker a negotiation, I think that day has passed. And I do agree fully with Jim's point that I was just reading an article written by a scholar yesterday talking about how there's no connection between Iran's power and the Palestinian issue, and I just don't understand how anyone could possibly reach that conclusion. Because if you go back to the revolution, I mean, the issue of anti-Americanism, the position against Israel, and as Jim says, Israel provides a great foil for Iran. That has been one of the great foundations keeping the regime alive. So if you deprive the regime of the Palestinian occupation, that's a huge, huge, huge destabilizing factor.
Syria could get worse before it gets better. There are harder line elements in the military that can do far worse than the current government is doing, and I think that's a concern that we all need to have. It certainly has lost significant regional support, but there's still a sense of wanting to figure out a way to incrementally move the situation forward, because the concern is what comes next. There are, when I talk with folks in the opposition, they discuss the absence of fear and how that has become so significant a role in the demonstrations. But there are still groups in Syria who are afraid, and they are significant groups, Christians and other minority groups, and the urban upper and middle class and the professional communities, not just the merchants, I mean, they look next door at Iraq and they see the fire next time. I mean, they're desperately worried about what comes next. And the opposition till this date, while there are some Christians involved and some of the professionals, especially those in exile, involved, people who don't want daily life to change, people who say, look, this is working okay, and we don't want to have a thing totally destabilized. We don't want to go through the next 10 years with uncertainty. They're still out there, and they're not moving from support not for the regime, but support for the status quo. If significant segments of that crowd move, I think that could be the end, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. I just don't. I don't think we ever understood the role that Palestine plays and the importance that it plays in the region. I've tried to explain it to folks. It's on one level, it's like Wounded Knee is to Native Americans. In another way, it's like what the Holocaust was to American Jews. It's a wound that never healed. It's something terrible that's happening to people very much like me, watching them from afar, and saying, that could be me, that's my story. Palestine is central to the Arab narrative. It's about betrayal. It's about treaties broken. It's about the West ignoring my rights. It's about history being out of control. It's about vulnerability. Countries that hate Arafat or hated Hamas or Arab leaders who, got fed up with the Palestinians draining their resources, would look at an Israeli attack on Gaza and say, that could be my kids, when they see those pictures play out for them. It's an issue we just never quite got. We always saw the Israeli side of the story, and we saw the issue through Israeli vulnerability and insecurity. I mean, we still talk about Sderot, which of course we should talk about it. People shouldn't have rockets thrown at them, in a nonstop way. But to play out the other side of that line, and the vulnerability and the insecurity and the hurt and the pain that Palestinians live with every day for decades now, is something that never penetrated. And there's a kind of a fed-upness in the region about it. And the UN vote is sort of the last gasp of the moderate leadership saying, give us something. Let us go home to folks and say we won something. And you're right, it's a nonviolent, it's an extension of a nonviolent strategy. And to deny them that, and to take that from them at this point, would, I think, be a not just a devastating blow to them, but it would be very hurtful to us. And what's frustrated me is not just that we're going to oppose it, but that we're working so aggressively to oppose it. It's like rubbing their noses in it in a way that is not hurting them as much as it's going to ultimately hurt us. And so I think it's a test. It's a big one. It's one that I fear will fail, but we still have a couple weeks to go before we make the final decision, although every indicator of what we've done up till now is that we're on the wrong side of it.
Does either of you have final thoughts you want to add?
That was it. For
Well-
me. Yeah?
I'm good.
No, I just, the comment I would make as moderator is that you've brought out in your talks also the reasons why this is so difficult. But you've also, I think, brought out, and the questions have brought out, some of the longer-term strategic factors for the U.S. that over time could make this calculation different, could make this calculation in a way that looks at the security of both parties in a way that's aligned with a different conception of U.S. interests. And, to me, the sort of key thing that has to change is that the calculus of interests that also affect the Israelis, which we haven't talked about at all, needs to be better understood. And I'll say thank you on behalf of NSN and POMED by saying, as the moderator, I've learned a tremendous amount from this panel, and I'm sure you all have too. So please join me in thanking our panel.
If some of you saw the cartoons outside, I failed to explain that this is how Iran sees the Arab awakening. So if you got some of these cartoons, one of them is the Saudis in a sea of Arab blood, with the U.S. taking a jolly ride, and probably so anyway, for a little comic relief.
Thank you very much. This was great.
This is not the report.